In the first presentation, we looked at the possibility that the Constitution of the United States makes the enterprise of Christian socioethics questionable. What we considered was that Christian participation in attempts to shape public policy, to shape law, violates the so-called separation of church and state found in the Constitution. We looked at the actual religion clauses in the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, which prohibits government from establishing a religion, and the Free Exercise Clause that prohibits government from interfering with religious liberty. Our conclusion was that, in fact, nothing in the Constitution prohibits participation by individual Christians or Christian organizations like churches from shaping public policy. We suggested at the end, however, that there are three kinds of reasons that separating Christianity from politics may be a good idea, even if it is not illegal or unconstitutional. In this presentation, we will make sense of those three kinds of reasons, beyond constitutional ones, for separating religion, Christianity, from politics. The first kind of reason has to do with the nature and purpose of religion itself, including Christianity. Some would argue that religion has primarily to do with the individual's relationship to God or the sacred, and with individual destiny. It has very little to do with communities or public life. Some Christians see things this way. An important understanding of the Christian message is one that emphasizes that its primary purpose, if not its sole purpose, is to get individual souls into heaven when they die. The idea is that because of human sin, human beings deserve to be punished or damned at their death. But Jesus Christ was slain on the cross as punishment for human sin, and those who believe in him and his cross are forgiven of their sins and go to heaven rather than hell when they die. Think about it. If that is a valid understanding of the biblical message, of the gospel of Jesus Christ, then social and political concerns are relatively insignificant. Even the church is significant only as the gathering of saved individuals to celebrate their faith and to spread the message of salvation in Jesus Christ. Saved people, people of faith, surely want to live according to God's will, and to the degree that public law helps support and nurture a Christian way of life, such Christians will try to influence the law. But think about this. If the law does not support a Christian way of life, nothing is fundamentally at stake from this perspective. You, as an individual Christian, may obey or disobey the law. And if you disobey or if you obey a law that's inconsistent with God's will, you can take comfort still in being forgiven. So from this perspective, impacting public policy, impacting government law, is relatively insignificant in comparison to the fundamental Christian message of salvation in Jesus Christ. Historically, such a radically separationist understanding of Christianity has been prominent in the United States. From the 1920s into the 70s, many who are called Christian fundamentalists were largely disengaged from public life, content to form a Christian subculture, grateful for the religious liberty they were allowed by the Constitution, even as they saw the country as a whole drift further and further away from their understanding of the will of God. While they surely lamented that drift, it was not seen as a profound theological or religious crisis. That changed after the 1970s with the passage of Supreme Court rulings related to school prayer and abortion. Many of those fundamentalists came back into the public sphere as a part of the religious right or the moral majority. But for a long time, a great many Christians were comfortable in this separationist perspective. Other Christian groups have maintained that radically separationist perspective. Consider the Amish and certain Mennonites. Those groups continue to make almost no effort to impact the broader society through political participation. They are content to hold on to their evangelical Christian beliefs and take advantage of the freedom allowed them to form their communities and live their lives largely as they see fit. I will never forget knocking on the door of a Mennonite home as part of a voter registration drive in which I was involved. The Mennonite man who answered the door refused my offer of assistance in registering to vote. "I do my voting on my knees," he told me. He meant, of course, that whatever attempt he made to affect society was through prayer, not political participation. In an important little book called Good and Bad Ways to Think About Religion and Politics, Professor Robert Benny of Roanoke College notes rightly that groups like the Amish and the Mennonites advocate separation, quote, because of the danger political involvement has for authentic religion. So the idea is that political involvement will taint religious practice. These, quote, sectarians believe that the gospel and the church it gathers ought to be untainted by the fallenness of the world, unquote. Therefore, to protect the purity of religion, he's suggesting some Christians don't participate in the dirty give and take of politics. A second set of reasons for keeping religion and politics separate has to do with the belief or the idea that historically, when religion and politics have been mingled, inevitably our political lives became more intolerant, more violent. The idea is often promulgated that when religion and politics get involved, violence and oppression is bound to increase. Some of our founding fathers seem to have this view. Consider these quotations from letters from George Washington to someone named Edward Newenham in June of 1792. He wrote, "I regret exceedingly that the disputes between the Protestants and Roman Catholics should be carried to the serious and alarming height mentioned in your letters. Religious controversies are always productive of more acrimony and irreconcilable hatred than those which spring from any other cause, and I was not without hopes that the enlightened and social policy of the present age would have put an effectual stop to contentions of this kind." 2 days earlier, he had written, "Of all the animosities which have existed among humankind, those which are caused by a difference of sentiments in religion appear to be the most inveterate and distressing, and ought most to be deprecated." Thomas Jefferson said something similar in a letter several decades later. He wrote, "On the dogmas of religion as distinguished from moral principles, all mankind from the beginning of the world to this day have been quarreling, fighting, burning, and torturing one another for abstractions unintelligible to themselves and to all others, and absolutely beyond the comprehension of the human mind." Well, ideas like these continue to be prominent in the 20th century and are prominent even into the 21st. There's a famous British philosopher named Bertrand Russell who wrote a little book called Why I'm Not a Christian. One of his chapters raises the question as to whether religion has made any useful contribution to civilization. And his answer was definitively no, religion has not. He said religion is based entirely on fear, and all that it's done has been to increase human misery. But look at what he says specifically about religions, more specifically Judaism and Christianity, and the issue of intolerance and violence. He wrote, "The intolerance that spread over the world with the advent of Christianity is one of the most curious features due, I think, to the Jewish belief in righteousness and in the exclusive reality of the Jewish God. The Church made much of the persecution of Christians by the Roman state before the time of Constantine. This persecution, however, was slight and intermittent and wholly political. At all times, from the age of Constantine to the end of the 17th century, Christians were far more fiercely persecuted by other Christians than they ever were by the Roman emperors. Before the rise of Christianity, this persecuting attitude was unknown to the ancient world except among the Jews. One of the things Russell suggests here is that it's the idea that there is only one God, or that somehow monotheism and a conviction that one's God is the only God is the source of this intolerance and violence associated with Judaism and Christianity. More recently, a well-known journalist named Christopher Hitchens, who died a few years ago, he wrote the following in defending his own atheism. He said, "We atheists do not believe in heaven or hell, yet no statistic will ever find that without these blandishments and threats, we commit more crimes of greed and violence than the faithful. In fact, if a proper statistical inquiry could ever be made, I am sure the evidence would be the other way." In other words, Hitchens is suggesting that the primary cause of violence and death in human history is religious conviction or religious belief, of course, when it gains political power or when it is made public and affects our politics. Well, obviously, if such claims are at all valid, it's a significant reason for keeping religion as far away from politics and political power as possible. A significantly milder version of a claim like this is one that points to the importance of separating religion from politics because of the pluralistic character of a modern democratic society such as our own. The basic idea is this: that in a democratic society, all citizens are to participate in the deliberative process through which public policy and law is determined. Therefore, the reasons offered in support of particular policy alternatives ought to be those that are in some sense common or public or shared by all the population. The problem with making religious appeals or justifying one's perspective on law or policy by appeal to religious claims, the problem with that is not everyone shares your religious claims, and not everyone can even respond in the terms that you have engaged the public when you make religious claims. Professor Mark Cladis, in an essay looking at 4 different ways for relating religion to public life, talks about the idea that religion should be banned from the public landscape. He describes the perspective this way: professions of religious faith are contentious and divisive unless they are rendered safe by being consigned to the private sphere, the sphere of voluntary association, the family, or the individual. They must not be brought into the larger public or political sphere because their partisan nature has great potential to introduce division and therefore conflict into the public life of the state. The idea is to keep religious discourse out of public political debate on the grounds that 1, religious beliefs are not subject to public reasoning, and 2, religion is therefore divisive. In this context, Cladis discusses or quotes a famous contemporary philosophy professor, Richard Rorty, who taught for a while at the University of Virginia. And he argued that the main reason that religion needs to be privatized is that and left out of political reasoning or political debate, is that religious claims are what he calls conversation stoppers. Cladis explains that Rorty has in mind a person making a statement which others have no response to, presumably because they do not share the worldview which the statement entails. An example might be helpful here about what Rorty has in mind by religious appeals as conversation stoppers. Imagine that someone were to say, quote, "The United States should double its aid to poor people in the third world because the Bible says that God desires justice for the poor and promises that one day the hungry will be fed. The Bible says that nations will be judged by God based on their response to the needs of the poor, unquote. Now, the argument we are considering here is that a religious reason or religious reasoning like that is inappropriate in our pluralistic democratic society. It's inappropriate because such reason is unlikely to be persuasive to anyone, or at least persuasive to those who don't believe in God or in the authority of the Bible. It's also inappropriate because when the policy is affirmed on these specific religious grounds, there's no possibility of the conversation proceeding towards some kind of agreement or compromise. For the one making the claim, there is nothing else to say, and for the one who does not believe in God or the Bible, there's nothing she can say in response. This seems to be what Rorty means by saying that such a comment is a conversation stopper. So, rather than appeal to the Bible and Christian convictions, you should abandon those and say something like, quote, "We should double aid to the poor because everyone is a human being about whom we should be concerned," unquote. Now, there's something with which a person who does not share my religious convictions might agree. And it doesn't suggest that my religious convictions matter in public discourse. Rather, it appeals to something all share, the idea that everyone is human, and we should all be concerned about every human. So, to summarize what we've said here, it may well be the case that religion should be kept separate from politics, even if the Constitution doesn't require it, for a variety of reasons. First, the primary purposes of religion are personal or personal rather than social or political, and indeed then Christianity becomes perverted when it gets too engaged with politics. Secondly, when religion and politics mix, inevitably intolerance and violence increase. Indeed, some go so far as to claim that the greatest sources of violence and death in history have been religious ones. And then finally, a milder idea that in a democratic, pluralistic society such as our own, where everyone is not religious and not everyone shares the same religious perspective, it somehow undermines effective political discourse if one brings religious appeals or religious claims or religious reasoning into the public sphere. Well, next time we'll look at responses to these ideas, responses that suggest indeed it is not wrong and it is appropriate to mix religion and politics. Next time.